I feel like the words, you need to do a risk assessment, should come through in a grumpy voice. There's just something about being asked to do a risk assessment that doesn't sound exciting. It sounds boring. It sounds, I'll admit it, I'm kind of, when someone says, oh, have you done a risk assessment? I'm thinking, oh my goodness, you party pooper. But the reality is, absolutely central to project management is making sure that you don't make anyone sick or dead or steal any money or, all of these things that could go wrong. And we go, oh no, they'll never happen. But guess what? They do. Okay, and so a risk assessment is actually a really important component. Without going overboard, a risk assessment is a really important component and important way of looking at your project. This is not about necessarily tying you up with more paperwork. It's about helping you to understand what could go wrong so that you can plan around it and avoid it. So I'm just going to give you a quick strategy. Now, what I would say, my caveat would be that different organizations have different policy stances towards risk and risk assessment. So many organizations have a pre-established risk assessment tool that you will need to use, okay? I'm not suggesting that I'm replacing that. I'm just giving you a really simple approach to thinking about risk. So, the reality of risk is that it varies on a couple of dimensions. It varies in a couple of ways. Now, everything has risk. Standing here in this studio has risk. It's very warm. Maybe I haven't had enough water and I'm about to faint. There's a risk associated. Now, the chance of that happening is very, very low. The implications of that happening are also not a big deal. Carpeted floor, I'd wake up soon enough, it'll be fine, right? So part of this is about saying, okay, we're going to go through and identify all of the risks as far as we can, all of the risks associated with our event. Now, that's not to say that we're going to do something about each and every one of them, right? But we need to decide which ones we need to think about. So the first part of this task is to go through your project plan, to go through what you're planning on doing, and just think, again, really slowly, what could go wrong? Now, I've spoken before about the importance of diversity in your team. Now, if you've done a good job of creating your team, you have somebody in there who is just constantly going, oh, but Jimmy will trip on that. Go and get them. They're the best person you can have in this situation. Someone who just sees the risk straight away. They're kind of risk aversive. They just see the risk. This is a brilliant person to have at this point. I know they've annoyed you in the past. This is the time to get them in and go, okay, let's, I need your brains. I need you to think about what could possibly go wrong. So the first thing, have a look at every single thing that you do and go, what are the risks associated? Particularly things like your site map. If you've got an event, what are the risks? And you can see in the other video where I talked about the tripping hazard on the cables, just think really, really slowly, what are the risks associated? Also think about the kind of existential risks. What are the risks? Is there a risk that no one will come if it rains? Okay, is there, is an outside event? What are all of those risks? Because this is not just about mitigating the risk associated with damage or hurting someone or costing money. It's also risks associated with the success of your event, okay? So I want you to think through, put your negative hat on for a little while, just a little while, I'll get you to take it off later, but think through and create a list of all of those things that are there. So if I was thinking, let's say we created, look, I'll go back to an event I used to run, and the event was called Bludge. And lots of people didn't like that name, but the kids did. And it basically had music. It had food sometimes, a space to hang out, dancing. They did actually dance. I don't know, let's call it that. And basically, if I was to go through this, I'd go, okay, what are the risks? I was letting the kids choose their own music, so inappropriate music might be a risk. Stealing my stuff, so losing the stereo. Breakages. There could be volume. That might be a risk with the police. It was a risk with the police, it happened. So we've got all of these different things. And I want you to go through really carefully and think, what are all of the risks? I don't care if you think, it's minimal, but we need to do this on purpose, right? So we need to decide, no, that's minimal and we don't need to deal with it. So once you've done that, then what we're going to do is just start to chart them. so that we can work out which ones we need to deal with and which ones perhaps we can avoid. Or just, go, okay, yep, it's acknowledged, but it's not that big a risk. Now, if we think about risks, they vary in a couple of ways. So they vary in likelihood. Likelihood, right? So the chances of something happening is an important factor. So for instance, there's plenty of big events that have a risk evaluation of a terrorist attack. Okay, now this might not be an issue if you're in, I don't know, Albury-Wodonga and planning a mother's group, but sometimes it might be. Now, the reality of a terrorist attack is it's actually the chances of it happening are really, really low. Okay, so likelihood is an important factor. Even if the implications are really high, likelihood is an important factor. The other part is impact. Oh, I'm off the screen. Impact. Now, the reality of impact is that even if the chances are really low of a terrorist attack, horrible example, even if the chances are really, really low, the impact of that is massive, okay? Absolutely huge. So if we're thinking about my youth event, let's say that drugs or an overdose was an issue, right? The likelihood, I wouldn't put it really high. I also wouldn't put it really low, okay? But the impact of an overdose, both on that kid and on the other kids around them, was actually quite high, so I'd situate it somewhere here, okay? Now, what we're trying to do is we're trying to identify the most impactful and high likelihood risks associated with your project. But there's another factor that I want you to consider, and that's the controllability, okay? Now, if you think about it as a rock, a really big rock, you can't control it. It's going to stay there. You can't do anything about moving it. You can't reduce the likelihood that it's going to happen, okay? But a really small rock, you can move that, you can shift it. So if we think about, if we think back to our music and we think about the police, right? We think about getting in trouble with the police for having music too loud. So the likelihood is fairly high. These teenagers love their music and they just keep turning it up. So the likelihood is fairly high. The impact is arguably not massive, but it's not good for my public image if I've got the police visiting every single week and they may actually close me down. So I would put it here. So we're kind of situated here, right? Which is a bit of an issue. This is something we need to think about. But the third thing that we need to think about is can we stop this risk from happening? Is it within our control? Okay? Now, if we were to picture this, we would go, oh, this is a little rock actually, because we can control it. We can avoid this happening altogether. Okay? And what this says to us is it's important because it has reasonable impact and high likelihood, and we can stop it from ever happening. Okay? Now, if we go through to, let's go back to terrorist attack because I can't think of anything else. If we go through to a terrorist attack, the likelihood is incredibly low. Okay, so we're down here somewhere. It's just, chances are it's just not going to happen. It hasn't happened that often in the past. Chances are it's not going to happen in the future. But the impact is massive, right? Now, when we come to the controllability, are we talking a little rock or a small rock? Okay, do we have any control? No, we don't. Okay. Oh, that disappeared. So no, we don't. We don't have any control over this thing at all. And what that says to us is that we need to have a plan in place for if it does happen, because we can't stop it from happening, like we could with the music, we can stop this from happening. We need to have a mitigation plan if it does happen. Now, I would argue that in this case, a small event, because it's such a low likelihood, you wouldn't actually need to have a mitigation plan. However, if we're talking, so let's say we're working in a really, really high risk area and we knew that we were going to have fights with weapons, right? So we go, okay, fairly high likelihood, fairly high risk, and the control, our ability to control it, we've got some, so arguably we've got probably more influence than we would with a terrorist attack, but not a lot. So in this instance, we would actually need to come up with a plan, two plans. One is how do we reduce the likelihood of it happening? So how do we get this down? Okay, we can't really influence the impact, but we can make a plan for if it happens. What's our plan if it happens? What do we do? Okay, when things go wrong, when the best prevention doesn't work, what do we do in response? Okay, now this process is a really easy and fun way, of thinking about your event and making sure that you've got a clear account of how you're going to avoid risk in the first place. So how you're going to kind of get around it and change it, what strategies are you going to take, and then how you're going to manage it, right? So the bigger the circle is, the more likely that you're going to have to manage it. The smaller the circle, the less likely. But what you're looking for is to deal with things that are kind of in this area, right? So deal with things that have reasonably high impact and reasonably high likelihood. There's very little point dealing with, certainly prioritizing things that have very low likelihood and very low impact, okay? But it's important to map them out and be honest with yourself and ask whether this has high likelihood and high impact, because sometimes we just like to be a little lazy. And this process is about making sure that you're not lazy and really thinking it through. So think carefully about who you get in the team to be involved in this process to articulate exactly what you're going to do. The next part of this is writing it down, okay? Make sure you've got a plan, implement the plan. This helps you to map it out and identify exactly what the most important thing is. Give it a go, you'll be surprised. It's not as bad as the risk evaluation form that you might have to fill in for work. So give that a go, you'll find it really helpful for identifying the challenges.